Your journey of reinvention and finding your authentic calling is something I deeply admire, especially as someone navigating my own path in the creative and entrepreneurial space. Can you share a pivotal moment or decision in your life that really set you on the path of seeking your calling?
I think as far as seeking my calling goes, I think I've had the same thoughts that all of us have at various times, which is, what do I want to be when I grow up? What I think is interesting, at least for me, is I've discovered it's really less of I'm going to get there and find that thing, and more of a let me have this journey and explore and kind of discover and dig deeper as I go. I've always been blessed to be able to go from things that I love to things that I've loved even more, as opposed to go from things I hate to something that I liked or that kind of thing. And a lot of it's just because I focused on always looking back and going, okay, what are the parts of this, whatever this is, that I enjoyed, that gave me energy, that fed my soul? And then what are the parts that didn't? And then I've tried to align myself more and more to get more of the stuff that I love and less of the stuff that I don't in everything that I do. And so, as a school teacher, there were the things about that I loved. I actually studied to go into medical research. There were parts of that about that I loved. There were parts about that I hated. It turns out it's about chasing grant money. Didn't really want to do that the rest of my life. So I pivoted and became a school teacher. And there were parts about that I loved. There were parts I didn't. I pivoted. I went into the corporate world. Parts I loved, parts I didn't. And then now as a coach, I get to do much more of the things I love. Guess what? There's still some things about the job that I don't love, but I think that's true of every career and calling that we have as well.
Okay. Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing. Now, I know because of our previous conversation leading up to this, you mentioned a dramatic financial challenge that brought you and your wife to a difficult point. Many of our listeners face financial stress as they navigate adulthood. Looking back, what were some of the most crucial mindset shifts and practical actions that you and your wife did to do two things? I think you accomplished two things. You guys were able to overcome the financial hardship, which, as you know, is one of the leading causes of, marriages dissolving. Mm-hmm. And then also to fall back in love, where there might have been some loss of trust.
So we actually had gone through, just to give folks a little bit of the background. My wife and I, when I was a school teacher, I was making about $40,000 a year. We had run up a large amount of debt. We were over $50,000 in debt at that time. We weren't talking about it. I was, in my mind, protecting her from it, shielding her from it, not sharing that burden with her. But it was weighing heavier and heavier on me. I actually became suicidal because of it, figuring out a way that I could take my own life, with the thought that I would have insurance money that would pay out and that would pay off the debt, and then she'd be okay. As my wife made very clear to me later, that she'd rather have me than the insurance money. But, at the time, that wasn't how it felt. It felt like that would be a solution. And because we weren't talking, because we weren't really fighting about it, we were just drifting apart because we weren't communicating. Yeah. And for me, what really kind of was the trigger is I would be driving home late at night, which was actually when I was having these dark thoughts, and they changed the lineup on the radio, and I started hearing this show. It was the Dave Ramsey show, and hearing people talking about getting out of debt. And I'll tell you the truth, I argued with the radio all the way home. I was yelling at it about how stupid this was, that nobody could do this. And then I realized that was the first night in a long time that I hadn't actually thought about taking my life. And so I kind of began to listen to it. And after about a week or two, I went to my wife and I said, okay, I need to come clean. And I told her all the stuff that was going on. And she's like, yes, I already knew all of this, but you weren't telling me. So I was pretending like I didn't know. Wow. And we kind of turned around and said, okay, we've got a choice to make. We can either go our separate ways, or we can decide that we're going to do this together, and we're going to put our heads down and put our shoulders together and just change the way we're living.
Yeah.
And that was the mindset shift, was going, wait a minute, it really isn't about how much I make or how much debt we have or any of the other things. It was about what we did, and it was about doing it together. And so we completely revamped the way we communicate about money. We completely revamped the way we communicate about everything, began to share that burden, began to dig our ways out. And over the next 2 years and 11 months, I'm not allowed to round that to 3 years. My wife will beat me. It was 2 years, 11 months. Okay. We actually ended up paying off over $70,000. We paid off $78,846.52. Okay. But we did that. And you'll notice, by the way, when I started, I said we had $50,000 of debt. That's because in the middle of the journey, I was put into the hospital, had 2 emergency surgeries. We lost a job, got a new job, all of these things that life happened in the middle. But we did that, became completely debt free, and kind of turned around the way we look at money, the way we communicate about money. And we continue to do that to this day. We paid it off in 2006. So it's been a while now,
Incredible. Well, congratulations to you and your wife. I know that's a huge feat. And I do want to get into all the practical skills that you learned, because I know you guys didn't have finance background, even though you had two income household. But first, the fact that you were struggling with suicide on your own as a man, I do want to get into that mindset. What is it about society that sets up an environment where men don't feel safe sharing something, even with your safe space, someone as your wife, not to mention, other people that are part of your community outside of your intimate relationship?
The first answer is testosterone poisoning, which is we're raised in culture, we're enculturated to believe that it's weak to talk about our issues. It's weak to admit that we need help. That's sort of the message you get from movies, from TV, from friends and family. And I was raised by an alcoholic father. He was very emotionally distanced. I was treated that way, and I kind of internalized that. It took me years and therapy and other work to figure out, that's not a good way to live, and to be able to tell my son I love him and do all of those things like that and change that, because it really is about that message of you're not allowed to share. That makes you weak. And I think men want to be providers. We want to be someone who protects people and kind of that warrior spirit, at least on the whole. And that's kind of counter to that. And so learning to be open and honest I think actually makes you stronger, not weaker, because that's showing that you're strong enough to kind of go against that message of what the culture tells us we should do.
Absolutely. I think it's changing now. Would you say that?
For some men, I would hope it's changing universally. I also think there's, in the world we're in right now today, I think there's some negative pressure. You look at the Andrew Tates and other folks that are very putting out that what masculine alpha male kind of messaging. And some young men get attracted to that and see that as a path to success. I don't believe it is, but I've seen that there's a counterculture kind of going backwards too.
Yeah. Definitely. Now, I want to shift gears for a bit. You serve actively in your church and other nonprofit boards. That speaks volumes about finding alignment in your life. For listeners who might feel disconnect between their daily work and a sense of purpose, what advice would you give them on how to start? And then also, how important do you think, because I know we live in such an individualistic culture, right? It's all about yourself, chase your dreams and all that. But I have this working theory that putting yourself in a position where you're responsible for people outside of your immediate family, but some people aren't even responsible for their family. Like, what role do you think that plays, like volunteering in churches and nonprofits, et cetera?
So, there's two different ideas there. And so let me kind of separate them, and then I'll talk about each. So the one is that finding your purpose or passion and your work. And earlier I did talk about aligning my calling with, what I do as a career. But I think it's important to recognize that that's really two different things. There's your calling, and the actual word we should use for that is vocation. And then there's kind of what you do to make money, which is your career. And the word vocation literally comes from the same root word as vocal. So calling, that's literally what that word means. Where the word for career, actually, believe it or not, comes from the word for cart, something that gets you from point A to point B. Right? Something that's a mode of transportation. And so they are two different things. Your purpose is something that weaves throughout all of the different roles of your life. So again, one of the reasons I serve on nonprofits to do that is because that feeds part of my calling. So does what I do as a coach for my career. So does what I do as a husband or a father, or all of these different roles. So your calling is kind of the why behind it, where your career may just be a specific thing you're doing at this point in time to get paid. And it may or may not fully align with your calling. And so I think it's important to separate those. And when you do, then you begin to look at everything you do and look for those little nuggets of purpose that weave throughout them. And it also lets you then fill in the blank. So for instance, if part of your purpose is caring for folks that have special needs, And maybe your day job doesn't give you any opportunity to do that. Okay, well, how can you serve that part of your purpose outside of your day job? And that may be serving on a nonprofit board, that may be volunteering, that may be all of these others. Which brings us to the second half of that point. How important is it to pour out into others? I truly believe, and one of the frameworks I teach in my book is kind of this idea of invest in yourself, which is first know yourself,
Right.
then invest in others. That's that part that you're talking about, because there's where you get feedback from the world that then comes back to you and reinforces that direction of that you're going. It's the thing that tells you you're on the right track or not. It's the thing that tells you I'm getting energy from this. This is feeding my soul. This is telling me more about who I want to be. And so if you don't do that second step of finding places to volunteer and to serve and to help others, sometimes maybe that be part of your business. Other times it may just be something you do as a volunteer. You don't ever get that feedback to let you know that you're on the right track so that you can kind of keep growing your calling. And so you get stuck in one place.
Definitely. Definitely. I think that's well said. And it's a very important perspective because right now, unfortunately, which is an important message, we're being fed the message that if your work doesn't align with your purpose, then you should right away quit it and go try to go and search. I always say purpose is a luxury. You know, for someone like myself who comes from environment, I'm an immigrant. I come from environments where, you know, our hobbies or whatever weren't fostered. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So for some people, you find your purpose on the way, or I always like to say you can define like the minimum, like, for example, for me, as long as I'm making a difference in someone's life, that's some level of purpose. It's not my ultimate purpose. It's not my life's work. But as long as I find that in everything I do, I'm satisfied. So I don't want to veer too much. My earring just fell, but that's fine. I do want to get into your book for a second, Inspired Living. I'm so inspired by your story. Inspired Living, assemble the puzzle of your calling by mastering your time, your talent, and your treasures. That book really resonates with the multifaceted nature of adulting. Let's break these down. When it comes to time, you emphasize being productive, not just busy. At what point did you come to that realization? Let's start with that.
It was actually pretty late. I had been studying productivity and time management and all of these things for probably about 30 years before I came upon that frame of, you know, there's a difference between busy and productive. And again, it kind of goes back to culture and society. Think about it for a minute. Busy is a badge of honor nowadays. You walk up to somebody, you say, "Hey, how you doing?" And they go, "Oh, I'm busy." Right. And you go, "Oh, me too." You know, and everybody's busy, you know. But here's the truth. All busy means is doing a lot of something. So let's go back to work for a minute. If I offered you $100 a day to go to my backyard and on one side of the yard, there's a pile of rocks, and I want you to pick up a rock one at a time, carry it to the other side of the yard, put it down, and then go back and forth. And when you run out of rocks, pick them up from the second pile that you made and carry them back to where the first pile was. And just do that all day long. And I'm going to pay you $100. Well, some people might do that, but they're only going to do it so long. Because at some point it's going to be like, well, I've got enough money now. And kind of like what you said about purpose as a luxury, you know, I've got enough money now that I'm going to go find something that's a little bit more purposeful to do. This is just all I'm doing is I'm busy carrying rocks. I'm not really serving anything wider than that or deeper than that or connecting any deeper. Even if I paid you $1,000 a day or $10,000 a day or $100,000 a day, at some point you'd be like, I'm done. You know, I can't carry rocks anymore. And so there is a degree to which, you know, having our heart fed and our autonomy and all of those things becomes important. But again, you would be busy in all of those settings, no matter what kind of money was attached to it. Productive, on the other hand, is when now all of a sudden there's a reason to pick those rocks up and carry them beyond just getting paid. So that reason may be you're building a wall. That reason may be you're building a cathedral. That reason may be you're, you know, laying the foundation for something. Now all of a sudden it's like now there's purpose and pay, you know, and so it's a little deeper, and you'll continue it longer and you'll go longer. So it's this idea of finding the work that we do that actually makes a difference. Now, don't get me wrong. There's still work you're going to have to do because guess what? The laundry still has to get done.
Yeah.
You know, there's stuff that you have, the dishes still got to get washed, you know, that kind of, there's work that you have to do just because it's part of surviving. But there's also things that you can do to bring more purpose into your work, and also make sure that the work you're actually saying yes to is the work that matters, the work that changes something, that moves the needle, that gets you out of just the tedium of busy work.
For sure. Would you say that's another version, essentially reverse engineering your goals would be a good strategy to lean on?
Absolutely.
Okay, that we don't fall into the trap. Okay, next I want to talk about talent. Often as adults, we might feel that our talents are underutilized or we're unsure of what our true talents are. What's your process for helping people identify their unique talents and then strategically leverage them in their work, relationships, or even side projects?
So I'll give you a real quick activity. Well, not quick. Takes you a little time, but an easy activity, I'll use that word, that you can do. So just take out a sheet of paper, a couple of sheets of paper, and divide it into 3 columns.
Okay.
And down the left-hand column, just begin to write everything that you've done, every role you've had, every activity you've done. I'm serious when I say every activity. I don't just mean things you've gotten paid for. I'm not just talking about jobs. I'm talking about, you know, that time you were the camp counselor. I'm talking about that relationship you had in high school. I don't care. Be as broad as you want and just brainstorm things that you've done in your life. This may take you a week or two, you know, kind of keep going back to it and adding to it.
Okay.
And then in the second column, beside each of those individual items, write down things about that activity that brought you joy. Things that fed you, things that gave you energy, things that you reflect back on and go, that part of that, you know, there's always something, by the way, even the things that you hate, you know, going to the dentist. Yeah, but there's still something about that activity that you can find joy in. So you always have to find something that you can bring joy from it. And then in the last column, put down things that you didn't like about that activity. You know, I didn't like the way the Novocaine felt when I was at the dentist, whatever, things that you didn't like. So what you're doing here is you're beginning to pull out of yourself ideas about things that you enjoy, things that feed you, and about things that you don't enjoy, things that take energy from you. If you begin then to look for patterns, you know, sit down and begin to look through that list and go, what keeps showing up in the love column? What keeps showing up in the hate column? Because that begins to give you an idea of what sorts of things that you're probably naturally gifted in. Because the truth is, the things that usually give us the most energy and bring us the most joy are, number one, the things that we're gifted in. And number two, they're the things that we don't even pay attention to. They become almost like a fish in water. You know, the fish doesn't know it's in water, or us in air. We don't recognize that there's air around us because we just live in it. Those gifts that come naturally to you are often the ones that other people are like, man, it is so cool you can do this. And you're like, oh, it's no big deal.
Yeah.
It is a big deal.
Definitely. Thank you for that. It's a process that I look forward to going through because I've been trying to sort it for myself in my mind, but I'm jumbled, you know? So I think
that's why putting it on paper helps, is
Yeah.
because you start to see things that pop out over and over again when you look back at it.
Absolutely. All right. Now I want to jump into exploring self-management and dispelling myths for tips for someone dealing with overwhelm. So you make a powerful statement that money management and time management are myths, and it's really about self-management. Can you elaborate on this?
Yeah, usually money and time are a symptom, and the real problem, I hate to tell it, is you. Now, here's the good news. You're also the solution. So it's not all bad news. But here's what I mean by that. Think about either one of those things, money or time. They're just finite resources. No matter how much money you have, you only have so much money. No matter how much time you have, you only have so much time. And yeah, there's things we can do to grow it and multiply it and do all of these things. But at the end of the day, it's still a finite resource. At any one time, you only have so much.
Yeah.
And if you spend a minute doing something, you can't spend that minute doing something else. Or if you spend $1 on something, you can't spend that same dollar on something else.
Yeah.
The concept is called opportunity cost. It's a fancy name for that. But what it boils down to is we can only do one thing with those finite resources at a time because we'll run out of them. And if you realize that, then that framework isn't really about managing the resource, because it's only so much. Instead, it's about getting into your own mind and your own decision making, and we're back to productive instead of busy, it's to begin to make decisions that align with your priorities, your values, and your goals, instead of just the easy decisions that you make in the moment. In other words, it's about saying yes to the most important things and letting go or saying no to things that aren't as important. And a lot of times, if you stop and think about where you spend your time, you're not doing that.
Yeah.
Most of us are spending our time in ways that aren't really on the things that matter to us. Same thing with money. A lot of times we're not actually spending the money on the things that actually matter to us. Instead, we're just kind of operating on autopilot because we haven't examined it and we haven't ever sat down and said, hey, this is what's important to me. Am I actually spending my time and my money that way? It's that old idea of, you can tell me all day long what's important to you, but if you really want to prove it to me, let me see your checkbook and your calendar and see where you spend your time and your money, and I'll tell you what's actually important to you.
Yeah, definitely. Now, you've reinvented yourself several times. For our listeners who might be considering a career change or significant shifts in their lives, what are some key principles or questions they should consider as they navigate that process of reinvention or rewriting their story?
First step, I think, always is to make sure that you're moving to something, not away from something. Here's what I mean by that. A lot of times when we're doing something that we're not pleased with, going back to your thing about we've got this idea that our job should align perfectly with our passion. If they ever just even a little bit out of alignment, quit your job. That's not the way the world works. So instead, it's about making sure that you're looking for something that is more in alignment, as opposed to, I'm leaving this because it's completely unaligned. It's a philosophy thing or a mindset thing. If all you're doing is looking at the negative and then you pick up and go to the next job, I hate to tell you this, but it's still going to be negative because you took you with you. And the frame you have is to look at the bad, not look at the good. And so you're going to keep finding bad. And these are the folks that you find that no matter what's happening, no matter what's going on, no matter what job they have, no matter what good news comes into their life, they can always tell you what's bad about it.
Yeah.
And we all know those people.
Yes.
Instead, be that person that says, okay, here's what's good about the job I have currently. Here's some things that I don't like about it.
Yeah.
Now, what skills do I need? What lessons do I need to teach? What do I need to add to my resume or my skill set so that I can move into something that has more of the stuff I love, and less of the stuff that I don't? Never going to go away completely necessarily, but more in alignment. Or alternatively, maybe this job is something that I want to keep and it's really good because it funds me either with money or with time and gives me the ability over here to spend time and money on the things that really, are the passion projects and those sorts of things. I know a few people that have a job that really doesn't align with their calling at all, but they use it to fund time and money over here in something that truly feeds their calling. And that is a valid way of doing it. It's not how I've done it in my life, but you can also do that. But you only do that by stepping back and finding the things that are good and then moving more towards those good things as opposed to away from the bad things.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of this information I'm so happy I stumbled into, and I've recently come in, I think a lot of us that have had to parent ourselves in one area or another are learning this information for the first time. Now, you mentioned transitioning from one job to the other, following this same principle or this practice. What would you say, other than self-awareness, right? Mm-hmm. What would you say made your multiple reinventions successful in leading you closer to your calling? Like, what was your standard for looking at the current position that you're about to leave and considering accepting the new one?
It's myriad. A lot of times for me, it ends up one of the most important things is around time, because for instance, when I was in the corporate job, I had a very long commute. I worked very long hours. When I was in the teaching job, I had a very long commute. I worked really long hours. So for me, getting rid of the commute became important, not because of the commute, but because it took me away from time with other people that I cared about. And so it's really about that time factor. So a lot of times it's stepping back, and this is kind of self-awareness, but it's more than that. It's stepping back and really evaluating what is the most important things. So like for me, I can give up some money to get time, because it turns out the time was more important to me. It's evaluating things that in that sort of way. Another thing is, again, that frame of being able to look at a job from the point of view of what in here is good and how can I get more of the good, as opposed to, I think so many of us, when we're looking at changing jobs, it's so much fear-based. It's so, I'm going to hate this job for the rest of my life, so I have to quit it right away. And again, I'm not talking here about being in a toxic environment. If you're in something where people are abusing you and all of that, that's a completely different situation. But
Yeah.
a lot of things that people complain about in their job, it's like, that's not abuse. That's just, you just need a better job, And so let's work to go there instead of panicking and running away. So I think that doing it not out of a place of fear, but out of a place of, even when I was in situations that were really negative, I still didn't run away in a fear-based mode. I tried to build in some safety towards the next position.
Yeah. And I love that you're a man of faith. If you have faith, if you believe in God, then you have to also believe that each experience stepping stool, toward the next thing. I'm a firm believer in that.
It's always good.
It's all good. Exactly. That's literally my life's motto. Like, it's all good, because it really, I know oftentimes it's painful. I tell people, like, God's or the universe's language is experience. And unfortunately, we're not taught how to have an emotional relationship to experiences that are less than pleasant. So I want to walk into some practical takeaways. For our listeners, you've already shared the tip of writing down your list of, all of your life experiences, essentially, the biggest milestones, essentially. But for our listeners who are feeling inspired by your journey and your insights, what other concrete action can they take this week to begin mastering their time, their talent, and treasures in a way that moves them closer to a more inspired life?
So I'll give you one real quick one, and then I'll spend a little time on a second one. Okay. So the quick one is this. It's a language change, changing the words you use. I'm going to go back to that busy word again for a minute. This helps us in our time area, but it actually helps us in money and talent too. So here's that word. You're no longer allowed to say, I don't have time to do that. By the way, you can change that and say, I don't have the money to do that. Okay. Either way, it works. Instead, for time, you have to say, that's not a priority for me right now. And for money, you have to say, that's not a priority for me right now. Same answer. Here's why changing your language changes things. Imagine for a minute that you're working at work and you're sitting there and you're kind of working late that night and you look over at your coworker and you go, I don't have time to make it to my daughter's soccer game tonight. They're going to look at you and go, oh yeah, I know, I'm busy too. It's just, we're just too busy to do that. If on the other hand, you were to look at your coworker and say, you know what, it's just not a priority for me to make it to my daughter's soccer game tonight. They would look at you like, dude, what? What do you mean it's not a priority to do that? Of course that's a priority. Go to your daughter's soccer game. Get out of here. Yeah. Because that language changes the meaning in our own brain, and it changes the way we look at it. We're no longer looking at it as just sort of a busy thing. We're now looking at it as a choice. And that's the truth. You've always got a choice. Always got a choice. And so when you take that, I also like taking out, I had to do it from my language and changing it to I chose to do it.
Yeah.
Because again, I had to buy a new car. No, you didn't. You chose to buy a new car.
Yeah.
I had to spend my money that way. No, you didn't. You chose to spend your money that way. So when you begin to change your language towards prioritization, towards choices, and you frame that way, it changes the decisions you make because it changes how you feel about them.
Absolutely. It puts you in a more empowered state.
And people have argued with me and said, no, what if somebody put a gun to your head? You don't have a choice. I'm like, I'm sorry. There are some things that somebody could put a gun to my head and say, you have to do this or else. And I'd be like, well, you're just going to have to shoot me. I'm not going to do that. There are other things where if they did that, I'd be like, oh, absolutely. I'll do that because my life is more important than that decision. But you always have that power of choice because no matter how extreme I make the situation, you could say, no, it's not worth it. This is more important than that. You can always choose. Absolutely.
Now, I want to talk about Inspired Stewardship. That's your podcast. So for everyone tuning in, please check in to Scott's podcast called Inspired Stewardship. You have a significant number of episodes What type of content can listeners find there that might further their support or their journey of self-discovery?
So the kind of message of the show, or the worldview of the show, is that I believe by mastering your time, your talent, and your treasures, you can learn to live out your calling. Exactly that, that theme keeps showing up. And so a lot of times it's a combination of interviews and solo episodes, and I cover kind of a few different areas. The interviews, they're always something to do with leadership, communication, time, productivity, money, those sorts of areas. And then in the solo episodes, I cover those topics, as well as on Tuesdays, I cover a spiritual topic of some sort. So I just take a Bible verse and talk about what it called to me or what it meant to me this week and that kind of thing. And so it's really meant to be kind of an inspirational, relatively short. Most of my podcast episodes are well under an hour, some as short as even 10 or 15 minutes, kind of more like a daily devotional, kind of a get started and listen and give you a good dose of energy to start your day, so that you can then go out and do things that matter.
Amazing. And now we're coming to the end. I know you offer coaching services. I look forward to doing a deep dive of your podcast, but what are some other ways that our audience can connect with you, learn more about your book, Inspired Living, and, possibly book a coaching session as well?
Sure. So I actually put together a landing page just for your listeners.
Right.
They can find that over at my website at inspiredstewardship.com, and then just put in / and adulting.
No
We're
way.
talking about adulting.
Really?
And actually on that page, there's some free resources. There's information about my book, my podcast, and then there's also a place where you can book a call. So I love doing that for everybody, because usually after a show, people have got more questions, and that's just a place you can go and, the only thing on there that costs money is if you buy a copy of the book. Everything else is free. And I put that at inspiredstewardship.com / adulting.
Wow, that is incredible. I'm so grateful. I didn't know you were going to do that. Yeah, thank you so much. Any last words before I let you go? Just with someone that is seeking hope, feeling a little bit discouraged, any last words that you want to leave them with?
I think that idea of you have the power of a choice that we were talking about earlier, to me, that's one of the most powerful things to realize. I talked about it earlier. I've had suicidal. I've suffered from clinical depression my whole life. I've got all of those dark thoughts and demons show up in my world too. And they show up for all of us. But the idea of recognizing that at the end of the day, you've still got the power of choice. You've still got that ability. And don't look to change everything at once. Just look for that one little step you can take. What's the small next action that you can take to move you forward? And if you do that day after day after day, it does get better.
Okay. One more thing, lightning round, because we have about a few minutes, like 3 minutes. Now, what way are you ensuring that you don't give into that toxic masculinity to create a soft emotional space for yourself? Now that you've got that experience. Yeah.
One is my wife. I lean on her quite heavily, and we have a very open relationship. She knows if I'm going through a dark time. I always tell her. She knows already, but I tell her anyway. And I think speaking out loud is important. I also have a group of men that kind of hold me accountable that I meet with once a week, and we do studies together and talk together, and I can be open and honest with them. I think that's important as well. And then the last one is, just that commitment to constantly growing and learning. So I've been in therapy, at various points in my life. I've sought that out. I'm currently back in therapy because last year I was having a little bit of a bad year. And so I'm like, okay, I need a tune-up. Let me go back and, work with somebody for a little while. I'm a big believer in being open to recognizing those periods and then seeking help from all of those types of sources.
Absolutely. Scott, thank you so much. I'm so appreciative of your time. Thank you. Okay?
Absolutely. Thank you.
Enjoy your day. Bye.
Bye.